Okay, I'm going to assume that there are people out there. You never know. The only person I can actually see is Frederick. I think everyone else. And Bjørn. Bjørn is here. Right. People are coming. It's nice to know you're not just speaking into nothingness, into the abyss. So welcome back to the final session. This session is not a focus on papers. It's actually a focus on prioritizing activities for Knoca, and it's something that I'm going to be running with Bjørn and I'll be running with Bjørn from the Danish Board of Technology and with a bunch of other members of Knoca who are going to be facilitating some conversations in smaller groups. There's a small group of us who have established Knoca, including my own institution, Centre for Study of Democracy, DBT, Climate Outreach, ECF, and others, who are at the moment forming a small management group. And there's no way that we can know what everybody in the network would want to do, and there's no way we can organize everything. And what we would like to be able to do is to facilitate different types of activities on those aspects of climate assembly practice that interest the members of Knoca. And remember, the members of Knoca come from policy, come from civil society, come from activism, come from academia, and all sorts of different. So we've got various different audiences here. So what we're going to do is we're going to break you into small groups to discuss and think about 3 questions. The first question is, what aspect of climate assembly practice needs the attention of the network? So what is it? And we've heard a fair bit about that today, and people talking about different areas. But what are those areas that you think of climate assembly practice need attention? Secondly, what sort of activities do you think that the network should facilitate? So it's one thing to say we need to focus on particular types of practices, but also what kind of activities? Do we need more research? Do we need more workshops? Do we need learning calls? What sort of thing would you like to see? And finally, that all important question is, what can you give to the network? So what contribution do you think you could offer to the network, whether that might be facilitating events, collaborating with others, but we really want to get a sense of what it is that you might be able to do. We're going to be discussing this, but also using Jamboards in the groups, but your facilitator will tell you about that. So we've got a decent amount of time. We've got at least half an hour where we're going to spend time together. And this is, if you like, the start of the conversation in the network about how we're going to prioritize activities and how we're going to function. So this is for us, is a really important starting of that process of co-designing what this network means and what it's going to be. Bjørn, is there anything you want to add, or did I capture everything?
I think you captured everything. I mean, just a quick note on what we had in mind is a series of relatively frequent and short events, starting already now in July, and then continuing until after the summer vacation and until April.
Okay, so the wizard of Zoom is hopefully going to shoot us into a whole series of groups, and then we'll come back. We'll have a summary of what came out of those groups, and then we'll close, and everyone can go and lie down. Right, welcome back, everybody. I'm looking for my Bjørn. Go for it, Bjørn. You're in charge of this bit.
Yeah, I mean, what we had in mind here was just to quickly share, highlights of our group discussions. So let's get on with it. Group number 1 goes first, please.
Thank you, Bjørn. I confess to some very poor facilitation by me in our breakout room. A very good conversation. We didn't make it all the way through the different areas of discussion, so my bad. Nonetheless, very much enjoyed the chance to share with my colleagues, and in particular Tom, Maria, and Giovanni. Tom for Sortition Foundation, who works on the recruitment for climate assemblies and citizen assemblies. Giovanni, Maria, we heard from in the first session, and a couple of other people joining us as well. And what we covered really was we mostly focused on what aspects of climate assembly practice we need more attention from Knoca. I thought some, and one of those points, so I'm not going to necessarily, I'm going to try and just cover 2 or 3 of them. I don't want to take up too much time, but was the thought of maybe bringing in a broader range of disciplines into the design of climate assemblies. There is a range, as we've heard throughout the day, really, there's so many aspects to climate change and the response to it to mitigate and adapt, which covers so many disciplines, and we're missing some of those from the design process. Sometimes perhaps it's a little bit technocratic. So for example, psychologists could contribute more to that debate. And then we also looked at, well, how can we kind of get over the quite low response rates we see to the invitation to join climate assemblies, and understanding to what extent that is related to the urgency to which people attach to climate change, and do they see it not as a problem for them, or is it actually that other barriers to joining are in place? So, or is it maybe an issue of trust, that people don't trust the people that the invitations are coming from? So we identified experimentation in this space, research in this space, maybe some comparative research on how to design a recruitment drive for climate assemblies that improves the response rate from the low rates that we currently see, and finally really helping the public understand politicians more, as much as politicians need to understand the public more, maybe, but understanding how climate assemblies can and cannot, what are the barriers to the recommendations from climate assemblies actually informing political action, so that we don't encounter this kind of disappointment and disillusionment when people very enthusiastically contribute and give up their time, and then find that the recommendations they've made go nowhere and they don't see those being acted upon. So what can be done there to improve public understanding of the abilities and capacities of politicians to respond to climate assembly recommendations? And I apologize, we didn't get on to the next stage, but I think we're going to leave those boards open for people to continue contributing thoughts about activities for Knoca moving forward. I'll stop there, but happy to take any questions. And to my fellow contributors, I hope I've done justice to your great ideas in my summary.
No, but it's perfect timing to move on to group 2. So I'm glad you didn't make it further, Chris. Thanks.
Yeah, so we were group 2. We had a nice little group. On the first question, there was quite some, a few groups, I suppose, of questions. One was about a bit more detail on how you design the mandate of climate assemblies and how you break it down, and also which is the information that goes into them. You know, what are the information that people need to make balanced judgments and so on. So really more actually coming from the sort of climate knowledge side, which I think is exactly what we want from Knoca as this sort of meeting place. There was also some really good thoughts about working on a bit the process aspects, which probably aren't necessarily exclusive to climate assemblies, but really how do you make the right kind of setting that creates trust and honest participation and makes people feel included and safe and so on. So some, you know, better gathering knowledge and sharing on that aspect. Question also on the use of subgroups, which keeps coming up. And then another point on how do you ensure that the accompanying activities that we were hearing about do actually happen. And then there was also some bigger questions about the role of these sorts of processes overall in the sort of political economy and the balance of power. So how can we make sure that citizens have a more dominant role in climate discussion as compared to, you know, the people who currently have the power, and that may be partly to do with institutionalization, but also possibly just barriers and opportunities within the current system. On the activity, so there are lots of things that could be dug into there, some as research, probably some as exchanging things that's already there. On the activities that Knoca could get involved with, I think the good thing for me to see was that there was lots of things that are kind of in line with what we were hoping that Knoca would do. So again, on the climate side, so having a sort of basic information set that is updated more regularly than the IPCC to make sure people have got the right information, and also digestible information for commissioners of assemblies assemblies about the benefits of assemblies and how to do them. So several suggestions of sort of comparative discussions and learning sessions from different assemblies, and some thoughts about training for decision makers, if we can sort of, if they have an interest in it, on both the whether and the how of doing assemblies. And generally, I think the overall message that came through was about building a community of practice that can regularly exchange thoughts and be a place where people can come to find the right answers. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Erica. You are a speed talker. That's very helpful in situations like this. Thanks a lot. Group number 3.
Yeah, thanks. We also had a good group with interesting discussions, starting with talking about evaluations and how we could ensure or focus on getting external evaluations so that we avoid a quote-unquote glorifying view of organizers positively evaluating their own creations. And from there we went on to discussing when to have a climate assembly. So more people mentioning that you might have people from different places requiring or requesting a climate assembly and asking about how to recruit people, how to facilitate, how to do this and that, but do not necessarily ask the question of whether they actually need a climate assembly in the given context. And related to that, there was a point that there's a lot of things going on in this field, and that there are a lot of organizations doing stuff, and that we should also be aware and focus on the other organizations, networks contributing, exploring, organizing stuff around this field, so that we don't replicate stuff or that we get constructive interactions. And then the last discussion was on the remit and the scope of the climate assemblies, and that there's been this tendency to have very broadly scoped remits, but whether that is actually, whether the climate assemblies have been designed accordingly. So having a very broad remit and then selecting 100 citizens, putting them into subgroups, should they actually have, and in the subgroups discussing different aspects of the remit, should they actually have a more narrow remit discussing the same thing in the different subgroups, stuff like that. But also whether to which extent the assembly members should have control over the remit and influence it. And then we just had a brief touch on the sort of activities that Knoca could facilitate, and on the one hand, sharing more empirical data, more research, having research workshops where you could discuss different types of methodologies and findings, but also then just having knowledge sharing events, bridging different groups, being able to facilitate conversation between different actors, having a role in this field. Yeah, I guess that was it.
Thanks, Frederick. Let's move on to number 4 straight away.
Yes, thank you, Bjørn. And thanks to the participants of room number 4, Robin, Diane, Eric, and Charlotte. I think that there are common issues that were mentioned already. We believe it's important to have a better understanding of the attitudes and maybe the projections that some policymakers may have regarding citizens' assemblies and especially climate assemblies, because they tend to have this vision of what the process is going to be and what they expect to come out of it. And when confronted with reality, this can generate bad outcomes. So, and in connection to that, we think that it would be interesting to have an assessment maybe and try to understand with policymakers from different places in the world. And to complement that, probably with training, especially dedicated or towards policymakers. Also, there was a suggestion to maybe try to draft an assessment of the skills and resources that are needed when you organize a climate assembly. There was also the issue of what Robin called the elephant in the room, I think in a tweet, on how do those climate assemblies deal with bigger issues like capitalism and growth, for instance. And there is a connection to make with some criticism that we saw also, or that I witnessed from people in Ireland, where it has been dealing with societal issues. But when it comes to economics and social policies, citizens' assemblies have not really been tested on that, and especially after the economic crisis in Ireland. So that could be very interesting. The issue also, a question was, maybe the processes should not be only connected and trying to answer to a question from the commissioning authority and governments. Do they need to address, or do they need to be actually talking to other audiences or activists trying to build more pressure for the governments to act on the proposals? And lastly, we also had a remark, or maybe it's interesting to try to understand how the effectiveness and the impact of the processes when they are connected to voting cycles. For instance, the Scottish Assembly held its final report for after the election in Scotland, whereas the German Climate Assembly is trying to deliver the outputs before and to influence the next federal elections. So that could be something interesting to study. And finally, as to a remark because we have a very maybe European or Western world concentrated discussion here, it would be interesting to try to have a look at what the Council of Europe has been doing, because it's bigger than the European Union. And we could also have a look at democracies at different stages, or that are developed a bit different, and how that can be adapted there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Lise. Group number 5. Dermot is group number 5.
Okay, yes, sorry, I was confused because Alina popped up on my screen there. So I was in a group with Bjørn and with Pete, Brian, Sergio, and Nick. We had a wide-ranging discussion. Pete, who works with Shared Future in the UK and works on a lot of local citizens' assemblies and juries, made the point that we should consider expanding the remit of Knoca beyond the national level, and that there's a proliferation, particularly in the UK, but also elsewhere, that there's a proliferationof mini public type processes dealing with climate change, that would be risk missing out on if the focus remains on the national level. Pete also made the point, and I think this might be more pertinent perhaps at the local level than the national level, that it might be useful to provide resources for policymakers to try and equip them to deal with the outputs from citizens' assemblies. So his sense was that in some cases it may not be that policymakers are necessarily resistant to taking on board recommendations, but they may just not really understand what to do when these processes end. So kind of building capacity of policymakers, not just to commission climate assemblies, but also to understand what to do when the processes end. We also had a discussion around the question of kind of the whole question of impact, so that emerged as a quite prominent theme that Knoca we thought could focus on, and linked to that, and linked to the discussion earlier this afternoon about kind of national specificities and path dependencies and so forth. I think we agree that it's important not to just end up with the answer being it depends. That that in the work that Knoca does, we need on the one hand to take account of national specificities, but on the other hand, not just come up with the answer that everything is nationally specific, and that we can't say anything more generalizable than that. There was a suggestion that Knoca could focus on how to integrate different types of knowledge, so different types of expertise into climate assemblies, and a suggestion that we should be producing guidelines and standards and kind of best practice, and kind of from the perspective that some of the processes, and I think this again goes to the subnational level, that there's a proliferation of processes and that they're not all necessarily living up to the name of climate assembly or whatever we might call them. In terms of what activities, so those were all what areas. In terms of what activities, I think we agreed that information sessions, events would be helpful. That as more and more of these processes get underway, it's harder and harder to keep track of what's going on out there. And so the kind of event that is forthcoming on the Scottish Climate Assemblies is quite helpful, just to get a sense for the uninitiated of how that process has played out, reports and best practice documents. And then one other suggestion was a platform for networking, so that Knoca would be a way of finding other people working on these topics. So Bjørn, I hope I've done our discussion some kind of justice in my summary there.
It was perfect, Daniel. Thanks a lot. Group number 6.
So hi everyone, we had a great discussion, and our group had a mixture of practitioners and researchers, which was great. So some ideas have already been mentioned, but one that got most votes in our group was research and kind of exchange of information, how to get a buy-in from politicians for the climate assemblies. And the links into the established policy cycle are something that we discussed earlier today. So there is a need to look more into those issues. There have been support for and focusing on design questions in terms of how to run, the best practices on running the assemblies and following up, facilitation methods. Interesting suggestion that got quite a bit of support is learning from mistakes, creating a community in which such an open reflection is possible and welcome, and hopefully Knoca can deliver that. Framing mandates and establishing links into information-based, also discussion and reflection on who is evaluating climate assemblies, what perspectives matter and what approaches are there. The role of oversight and the nature of oversight, a steering committee in the climate assembly, the role of experts and facilitation methods, and the ways in which information is delivered to participants. So quite a lot of crossover with ideas that other groups have suggested. Also, question of what to do when recommendations are not adopted and reacted to by the government, and how to make them impactful, even if there is no political will. Again, the discussion we had earlier today pretty much goes also into that point. In terms of different ways that Knoca could address these and other issues, again, we suggested interactive information sessions, information sharing sessions, looking into particular examples, options and results, and an important point was made that the advantage of Knoca is that it can actually collect and solidify information, and so it can help members strengthen what they do in terms of practices around citizens' assemblies in their own countries, and also to share their experiences. And so the feeling was that workshops focusing on practical exchange of experience will be very important for networking and learning. Similar to group 5, there was a suggestion to create a chat or forum that will be available for discussion for whoever has ideas and challenges, sort of a platform where we can engage freely and at any time on any topic related to climate assemblies. Also, it was proposed that running trainings addressing the needs of different communities interested in climate assemblies, for example, on facilitation, evaluation, and communication specifically, would be important, again, in the spirit of learning from each other. There was a proposal to create a regularly updated database of climate assemblies, I think similar to points raised by others, and also a suggestion to make available the profiles of the network members, where they are, what they do, what kind of experience they have, and what kind of information and support they're looking for and could also offer. And we already had thought about some of this in the management committee, so perhaps Graham could comment on that suggestion later. And finally, creating a repository and sharing of presentations and key publications for Knoca would also be important. And finally, there was a proposal that Knoca members could become potentially agents to help safeguard the quality of climate assemblies in their respective geographies. Thank you.
Thanks, Helena. I think we have 2 more groups, right? Yeah. So we'll just make it almost in time. So group number 6, please. No, number 7, sorry.
7, that was us. Yeah, thanks. So I'll try and be brief. So we spent most of our time talking about what should Knoca focus its attention on, and in no particular order. There was a question about who presents. You know, how do we know whose knowledge is allowed in and given to citizen participants? Alongside that, a suggestion that there could be a wider range of voices and knowledge and experience put forward, less orthodox views, people's lived experience, etc., as opposed to just quote the experts. There was a question about moderation, which I don't think has come up much so far, but the table facilitators, who does this, how is it done, how are they trained, whether there is some contribution that could be made to making sure that is done well. On the question of impact, how can we make sure that these processes have impact, both politically in terms of policy and for other stakeholders? The point came up about a sort of local national distinction, that there are particular considerations to be looked at the local level, and there may be particular issues of trust and I guess sort of remit as well there. A point was made about how in these processes often the participants in them are able to sort of cross ideological divides, my words, but it gets us out of our bubbles, and there is this sort of solidarity. So how can we understand and promote the ability of participants in these processes to speak to each other well? A question about standards. What are the standards for these processes? Coming back to the complexity of climate change, that this is a huge, vast issue, but is sometimes dealt with in a couple of evenings. So what are the? I mean, this relates to the Knoca police in the chat there. How do we know and enforce? Not enforce, but how do we know what the standards are for these things? A question about taking into account scientific research, what science should be supported and included, urgency again, which is something I personally think is important to stress as well. The urgency, the emergency, the seriousness of this issue. It's not just a technocratic, how do we cut some emissions? You know, this is a vital issue. How can civil society outside of the process be involved? How can we set expectations of the participants in the processes, you know, so they're not disappointed, as has been the case in some cases? How can we ensure there is broader resonance among the wider public outside of that closed process? And we only really touched on the question about what sort of things could Knoca do, but one suggestion was that perhaps Knoca could support the sort of follow-up to deliberative processes themselves. So there's been a lot of talk about, you know, these climate assemblies, citizen assemblies happen, and then it sort of fizzles out, and, you know, you would like more of a follow-up. Well, perhaps Knoca could be involved in supporting some longer-term follow-up from such processes. And that's it.
Thanks. A lot of new input, actually. Thanks a lot. Group number 8.
That's me. Not that anyone's had enough of hearing from me. So my group actually revolted against using the Jamboard, which was interesting for people who are interested in participatory democracy. But there we go. So there was a couple of really interesting things about how Knoca could be a resource of materials rather than in order to reuse them across assemblies, because there's a lot of investment goes into sort of, you know, explaining the nature of climate change. Obviously, certain things will be specific to particular assemblies, but there could be some shared materials that we could use, that we could provide some insights into basic mistakes that are made, sort of basic recommendations and basic approaches, as we're already starting to do, showing how different parts of assemblies could be done in different ways depending upon political context. And those are the sorts of things that people would like to see Knoca focus on. In terms of activities, there was a real enthusiasm for the fact that we were getting people together, that actually this just mixing participants and hearing from people who have worked on different projects and in different positions in terms of policymakers and academics and activists and practitioners. That was really great. And there's some way that we can actually get in touch with each other, that, you know, some way of finding out how to get in touch with other people and what their interests are. And a couple of other interesting things in terms of how we could operate, that we aren't bringing members of the assembly, people who have been in assemblies, into Knoca at the moment, that we haven't done that. And people pointed to someone pointed to the Yale conference, where that was really which was on the French convention, which was kind of successfully integrated the perspective of members of the assembly alongside academics and practitioners. So that's a really interesting one for us to take away with, and a real aspirational one from one of the contributors about perhaps we can aim to do things together, and actually because we could learn to do things, not just talk about things, but actually doing projects together. And that's clearly an aspirational, but it was really interesting point that we don't just learn from talking, we learn from doing. So a really great, I thought it was a really interesting session. Back to you, my friend.
That's a lot of good input, and I guess back to you, Graham. I'm not going to summarize all this at this stage, other than saying that, you know, we will go through the Jamboards and collect and have a discussion about how we can accommodate all those different wishes and to what extent. Yeah.
Bjørn, you're a professional facilitator, my friend, a professional, you know, surely you could have just kind of come together and form great synthesis and sort of explain the way forward. No, is not you haven't been paid enough for that?
Experience has taught me to wait.
What, for someone else to do it? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, well, I'll do it later. Yes.
What we're going to do in the next few days, we're going to be sending round, based on some of the things we've heard today, a survey to you and to other members who weren't able to join us about the priorities for Knoca, for the network, and you know, to keep that conversation going, and also to reach out to you and ask about the kind of contributions that you think you might be able to make. Because as I said at the in the introduction and last night, that this network's not going to work unless we actually are all contributing in different ways. So so you know, we will reach out to you on that. We'll also provide access to recordings of the launch event for those of you who weren't able to make it, or for those of you who enjoyed it so much you'd like to watch it again, and for my mum, basically. And we're going to also record, capture some of the elements of this event as well. We will provide you with a summary of the resources and questions and the ideas that have been raised in the chat, both at the launch and in this event. And we'll send you a reminder of some of the forthcoming events on the Scottish, which was already mentioned, on Scotland's Climate Assembly on a social gathering, but I'll leave that to Erica to say more. We will leave the whiteboards up for the briefing papers if you would like to go in there and there were things that you've thought of and you'd like to add more, or you can always email us. The email is an easy one. It's info@knoca.eu. It's on our website, and we'll really like to hear from you at any time. I think this has been a really interesting day. I think it's been a long afternoon, but I think it's been a really productive afternoon. I'd like to thank everybody who stuck with us, and I look forward over the coming weeks, months, and hopefully years to working with you more closely so that we can take work on climate assemblies forward together. And at this point, I'd like to pass over to Erica, who it was all her brainchild, this, I believe. So it's all her fault we're here.
Thanks, Graham. Well, I wouldn't like to take such greater responsibility, but actually yesterday I did find the first piece of paper where we sketched out the initial ideas for the assembly, and it was really cool because it basically has, for the assembly, for the network, it really has come to shape as we'd originally hoped, and is really promising. So my name's Erica. I'm the Director for Climate Planning and Laws at the European Climate Foundation, and another one of its founding members. And I must say, it's really a very rewarding and gratifying moment to see it finally launched after several months of hard work by lots of people to make it happen. And really, what a rich and interesting couple of days it's been. I think it's fairly clear that finding ways to engage citizens in addressing the climate crisis is something that is igniting great passion and interest among some very brilliant people. And also it does feel like having a place to sort of pool and distill and share insights and even do projects together, as was just suggested, is something that can be really helpful. I mean, I definitely take away as well that there's a huge amount of questions to examine, which probably reflects that we're still in some ways quite early perhaps in the application of these processes to climate, and that the knowledge about climate and what's needed is also very much evolving. So lots, I mean, I couldn't try to recap them all, you know, questions about when assemblies are the right tool, how broad the mandate should be. I see a comment a couple of times in the chat about if, you know, broader mandates mean it emphasizes more the scale of the challenge, but then you get, if you break it down, then you get, if you don't break it down, you have the challenge of smaller groups. But then there's questions about whether citizens should have agency in determining the mandate, how to make the process as inclusive and safe as possible. How do we make sure that we're learning from past examples, also to maximize the chances of the legacy and the impact? And I think we had some really good ideas from the paper there, and the ones on legitimacy and resonance and so on. So there's no point me trying to recap everything we've heard over, what is it now, 5.5 hours from the past couple of days. But I think something that it's also very important for Knoca to do is to examine these very challenging questions, and also to make sure that we're regularly taking a step back and finding ways to deliver sort of practical and usable and implementable resources and recommendations and help to those commissioning assemblies who are sort of faced with this very large challenge of how to organise a complex process on a complex topic. And I suppose in some ways that relates to Dermot's point that we can't always sort of take comfort in the "it depends" conclusion. often we need to find ways to nail our colours to the mast and give the best of the insights that we can. And I was also delighted in this session just now to hear some really nice, creative, practical ideas about things that Knoca can do. So obviously sort of learning calls and training and things, but the idea about reusing materials that have been developed for assemblies, and I think setting up a forum that's always available, developing standards, and many other ideas. So I think as Graham and Bjørn have said, I think we will be taking really quite some time to re-listen to some of the feedbacks and look at the Jamboards and really try and make sure that we gather up those ideas and sort of channel them into some sort of workable program. That should also be informed by the survey that Graham mentioned. So you will be getting this survey, which will be another opportunity to input to what you think the priorities for Knoca should be, and potentially what you can offer as well. We do have some more events lined up, as Graham mentioned. So the next one will be on the 6th of July. We seem to be into Tuesdays. It's going to be the Tuesday, the 6th of July at 5 p.m. Sort of European time. No, not we're all Europe, except those of us that aren't. I mean, like Brussels French time, or at 5 o'clock, and we will have a learning call on Scotland's Climate Assembly, and we've got some excellent speakers who are really have been very closely involved in the Scottish Assembly that has just delivered its report. So Susie Townsend, who was head of the Secretariat, the facilitator and design team lead Kayla Scott, and Olivia Rascabar from the stewarding group will be delivering some information and learnings for officials and practitioners and civil society. That will be on the on the 6th of July, and I think should be a really good session to learn from what I think was a very interesting and quite innovative assembly, and one of the first that's been fully online. And that will be chaired by our dear friend Graham. And then on the 20th of July, that's again a Tuesday at 6 o'clock in CET time. I should have just said that. We will have a sort of more of a social gathering. Obviously, it can't be in person, which is a pity. That day may come one day, but for now, we'll all sit around our Zoom screens, hopefully with a drink, and sort of gather informally to just get to know each other and share some ideas on Knoca's future programme. And with all these sort of expert facilitators in our community, I think we'll find some fun ways to do that, given that it will be just a sort of a fun, pleasant session. And maybe we can discuss some of the things that have come up in these 2 days more there as well. So before we go, I just want to give really sincere thanks to to everybody who's been involved in this, to all of you who've been taking part and have stayed the course as well throughout this very long and intense session. I think everybody needs a little lie down afterwards maybe, but also to all of our moderators and our presenters and our panelists, and also all the people who've been working like troopers in the background to make all these ambitious events work. So I want to mention particularly Lise Deshotel, Mia Thompson from DBT, Leanne Deleg, and Mane from Climate Outreach, and several others as well, and again to all of you for taking part. And so I just would like to finish with a quote from a participant yesterday who said that they found that there was something festive and hopeful about the launch. And I really agree. I hope very much that we can carry this spirit forward, and yeah, I'm delighted to continue this journey together. Thank you very much.